Don't settle for fakes. My duel-taining is the real deal.
Hey everyone, it's mekklord. Another KC Cup is currently ongoing. It's on uploading. I'm not sure when I'm going to upload this. I'm not really good at planning ahead. But it is the perfect time to upload. That's right, another tier list. I'm doing yet another format because I just can't decide which of these formats I like the most. So, yeah. The principle of this format is the same as last one, meaning that tier 1 decks are going to be the decks to beat and the ones that are going to see the most representation. Tier 2 decks are going to be very popular, possibly as much as tier 1, but might not have the same results. Tier 3 decks are going to be slightly less popular, but might have some, positive matchups every now and then. A couple of like surprise entries. Maybe the breakout deck of this format will be there. You don't know. I don't know either. And rogue decks are going to be decks that are more popular than they have any right to be, and will not attain the level of success pertaining to their representation. Or maybe just decks that are, pretty cool but pretty niche, and have some devoted fans and players that, could maybe have an impact. So, starting with Burning Abyss, I think it is the very definition of a rogue tier deck. It's a deck that's been in the meta for a very long time. It's a non-quantity. It didn't really get any new tools to make use of, and there have been more and more ways of dealing with them. Infernoids are very good against, Burning Abyss. Graveyard Hate in general is pretty good against Burning Abyss. Ways to remove Beatrice off of the field without destroying her are becoming more and more common and prevalent. So all in all, I think Burning Abyss is going to see some representation. I don't think it's going to matter in the long run though. Next we have 3 Code Talker decks, starting with the pure Code Talker. I mean, like, without any Salamangreat or mekk-knight cards, with cards like Mathmech Addition, Mathmech Subtraction, Link Slayer, Dotscaper, cards that are I think this one is a rogue deck. I think it has been clearly established that the other 2 variants of Code Talker are just straight better. They have more consistency, they have more recurability, they have more staying power, they can do stuff after turn 3, which is very important for these kinds of deck. And the fact that this deck got nerfed with Lady Debug being moved to 2 also means that you're more inclined to check out these versions, which make up the lesser untouchability with other better engines. Salamangreat, mekk-knights, and like both of these variants I think are equally as good for different reasons. Mekk-knights represent bigger bodies and just bigger bodies really, but their issue is that you more often than not need to establish some sort of balls before you're really able to summon the mekk-knights, and they're usually better going second, but if you have the tools to go first, maybe you rely a bit more on back row as well. And still think it's a really, really strong deck. Salamangreat mekk-knights, more consistent in my opinion, more recursion, more flexible as well. But alas, as maybe a couple more choke points than the mekk-knight version, simply due to the fact that unless you open Signet Backdoor or Cross Swipe, you are prone to losing your guys pretty quickly. In the Salamangreat Code Talker variant, the Salamangreat cards are much more of an engine to facilitate the Code Talker build, whereas in mekk-knights, mekk-knights and Code Talkers kind of work together but independently, you know what I mean? So for this reason, I'm not sure if there's one that's better than another. I think mekk-knight Salamangreat, mekk-knight Code Talker is a bit better than Salamangreat Code Talker, but not by a lot. Then we have Crusadia. Pure Crusadia, I think, is copium at this stage. It's a really good OTK deck on paper, but in practice, it has very little to do when it goes first. It's not all that impressive, it's not all difficult to manage, and for this reason I think it's a rogue deck, especially compared to its much better variant in the form of mekk-knight Crusadia, which does a great job at complementing the deck ability to OTK while also providing it with some actual turn 1 plays that could be interesting and enough to make Crusadia an archetype that matters in this KC Cup. Up next we have DDD, and I'm torn between putting DDD at the bottom of Rogue or the top of tier 3. I think it's one of the best Rogue decks out there. What it does is not as consistent as it used to be, or even of that impressive, but it still does it pretty well. It is able to OTK. It is able to still draw a bunch of cards turn 1 with the proper hand. With less good hand, it can still make Xenophont pass, which basically is an OTK against some decks out there, like Phantom Knight, like Burning Abyss, like Infernoid and stuff. For this reason, I still think like the deck has a couple of good tools that it can use to, you know, just win a couple of games here and there. Plus, it's a very popular archetype, so I'd be surprised that there were no DDD players in the top 500. Next up, Infernoid. I think Infernoid is a tier 3 deck for sure. I think it's going to be really popular owing to its low budget. But I also think that even though it got 1/1, which is an interesting card, the deck's game plan is still incredibly linear and somewhat easy to disrupt, especially if the deck goes second. So for that reason, I don't think like Infernoids are that much of a threat in this metagame, although it's one of my personal favorites. Dark Magician is interesting. When the deck was revealed along with the new skill and everything, I thought it would be mostly bad. But it did get some decent representation at tournament. It's a very popular deck and a very popular archetype, and for this reason I also think this one is a tier 3 deck. It's a deck that you should be aware of, deck that you should be ready to encounter and to counter. But it's not all that powerful. The ceiling of this deck is pretty low, and overall it didn't really give Dark Magician decks that many new tricks to make use of. Sure, there's a couple of plays you can make with like the Dimension Illusion guy that searches the quick play that is sort of like comparable to Signet Crosswipe in that it allows you to dodge targeted hate. And there's I guess you could quick play into the fusion as well, which was a cool trick when Masked Heroes did it in 2017. So I don't know, still a decent deck though. Gookies have been completely gutted by the last KCC ban list, except that they are still somewhat playable, but with only one skill, the main event Gookie, which is a Go exclusive skill. I think that's owing to the deck's ability to OTK out of nowhere and still produce a decent board with the proper hand going first, or just rely on a bunch of back row if they didn't open full combo. I think it's still a tier 3 deck. I'd put it over Noids, maybe even over Crusadia mekk-knights, I'm not sure. It's definitely one of the stronger contenders as far as back row decks are concerned. You know, decks that entirely rely on their back row for their gameplay. But not entirely, but Gookies really appreciate, what's that trap called? Eternal Die? Unexpected Die? I think no, Unexpected Die is the spell that summons from deck. I forgot what it's called, but you know, the one that's like Gemini Spark but for warrior monsters. It's pretty good. Harpies are going to be on this list. I think Harpies is one of the weaker rogue decks. I'm not sure if it's better or worse than BA. I think it's definitely worse than BA. Harpies are seeing a resurgence after all of their cards got taken off the ban list pretty much, except for like Swallow's Nest, I think. And the addition of Red Rain has led some people to like experiment with this version of the deck that is able to hard draw into the Red Rain and then use Cyber Slash plus Red Rain in order to basically create a field that is very hard to contest, at least in theory. In practice, still just RPs, except your Book of Moon is now Red Rain and you still lose to the same stuff as you did in 2020. Was it 2020 this deck was good, or 2021? I think it was 2020, I forgot. Heroes are definitely either low tier 2 or high tier 3 contenders. I think I'm gonna You know what? I'm torn. I'm gonna put it in tier 2. By hero, I mean the version of hero that uses Hero Alliance as a skill, which allows you to search a bevy of fusion spells, including Super Polymerization, which can't be responded to, which is insanely busted. But also Polymerization or Miracle Fusion, which can also help in some scenarios. Add that to the fact that Liquid Soldier and Sunriser still give you a lot of card advantage. You're still able to use back rows such as IDP, Crackdown, Compose, you know, the limited 3 bunch, in order to win games that you shouldn't win most of the time. And this deck proves to be very good, very threatening, both due to the ability to OTK and to, you know, establish a field that is kind of hard to contest sometimes. Super Poly is just one hell of a card. Medolches, I think, are like one of the better rogue decks, better than DDDs in my opinion. In the last KC Cup, I didn't expect Medolche to do anything, owing to the fact that it seemed really mediocre, overly reliant on one-card combos. This is still the case, but the Dex pilots have proven to be able to build a version that is much less reliant on, much less condemned, shall we say, by bricks and problematic cards, and able to more quickly access its game plan with the use of back row and stalling until they get to draw a Magilene or the Petting Successor, and still making the classic plays from there. So Medolches are just good. Not that good, but better than I gave them credit for. Mekk-knights. Mekk-knights are either tier 1 or tier 2. I think it's a deck that is so good that it is actually made less good by mixing it up with other archetypes. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but Mekk-knights, the usual Mekk-knights game plan is to search a very powerful floodgate in the form of Secret, which is basically somewhat a better skill drain, I'd say, sort of, because it also stops effect attributes as cost, such as like the Infernoids, for instance, and then be able to OTK with the Galaxy package, which is still a thing that you can do. It's an insanely consistent deck. It's very powerful. It did get a couple of nerfs, but it's basically replaced additional copies of Blue Sky with additional copies of Book of Moon and Warning Point and Paleozoic Canadia, which still make sure that your opponent has a body on board for you to summon a Mekk-knight in the same column. It's still an upset deck. It's still a very powerful deck. It's a deck that a lot of people have. It's a deck that I think is going to be more popular than its variants that uses the Mekk-knight cards as engines. And probably like one of the 2 best decks of this format. The other being, of course, Metal Foes. No, just kidding. Metal Foes is an interesting rogue, maybe low tier 3, high rogue strategy. It didn't really get anything new, like the addition of Luster Pendulum. Is it Luster Pendulum or Master Pendulum? Whatever. The addition of like the Pendulum guy that pops a scale to add a scale of the same name didn't really change much about the deck. It still does the same little tricks that it did before, but it is a deck that is beloved by many. It is a deck with which you can experiment. I've played a Deathblock version. It was kind of fun. There are more versions of the deck that can perform admirably, but the ceiling on this deck actually has been elevated with the new Dark Magician support. Piercing the Darkness rather, is a strong spell that the deck has been able to use, except that it is an unsearchable card, so you have to hard draw into it, and while you do have some ways to get into your deck, it's not always guaranteed. Odd Eyes is still around also, and I think it's potentially like it should be maybe around there. Maybe I've placed BA too low. I think BA is better than these 2 decks. There we go. Odd Eyes is, you all know what Odd Eyes is. It's just a pendulum strategy. It still does the same rank 7, still does the same rank 4s. Abyss Dweller is pretty good in this metagame. And sometimes you get to draw Necro Valley, so you can use it, but the deck's like viability stop there, basically. There's nothing new that Odd Eyes can do that other decks can't do better. Speaking of new decks, Phantom Knights, like probably uncontestably the best deck, or one of the best decks of this format. is going to be very represented because it is insanely cheap to build, but also somewhat easy to disrupt, especially if you end up going second. I feel like the PK end board is not all that threatening. Like Dark Requiem set 1 pass is not nearly as good as people give it credit for. For this reason, I think it's even weaker than mekk-knights. I think mekk-knights are still like the deck / engine that is going to see the most representation in this KC Cup. Speaking of, we have Resonator mekk-knights, but I want to talk about pure Resonators first. Resonators are going to be, I think, somewhere in there. I think pure Resonators are consistent enough at setting up what they do. Going first. Going second, it's a much harder sell, especially considering that Book of Moon is very omnipresent in this metagame, can also be used against Resonators going first. Fun fact, if they activate Red Brain and you Book of Moon the huge synchro monster, the huge synchro monster gets banished. That's very fun. Keep this interaction in mind if you plan on playing seriously during stage 2. It's a good deck, but you know what could make it better? That's right, it's mekk-knights once again. The ability, like mekk-knights is just an insane engine, and any deck that is made better by using mekk-knights should play them, because it's an archetype that just fits in so many playstyles, generates bodies for basically free, bodies that it can use to summon from the extra deck or to beat you over the head with. It's just an insane deck archetype. I really hope we see some nerf to mekk-knights after this one. Speaking of archetypes that I absolutely hate, Rose Dragon's probably one of the better tier 3 decks. I don't know why Rox Rose was unlimited. I don't know why Basil Rose Shoot is still unlimited. Like, these two cards form a resource loop that is very hard to deal with. The deck is still doing the same thing as it was 8 months ago, which is Zeta or Yazi turn 1 set 3 pass, one of which is a Basil Rose Shoot, so you get punished if you MST this one. Just an insane deck that actually got more tools with the recent mini box, and the ability to use Shooting Riser Dragon in order to make plays during your turn as well. I saw a version that was like using Shooting Riser Dragon and the Dark Magician level 2 guy, Dark Magician's Robe, that summons itself from your grave if you activate a back row. So you would send this with Shooting Riser Dragon, it would become level 5, you'd activate a back row because of course you're playing Rose Dragon, and then you'd summon this bad boy out and make black rose, and oh cool, you get to float off of Basil Rose Shoot too. Completely busted. Absolutely hate this deck. It's not that good, but I really want to see it nerfed. Speaking of decks that are not that good anymore, Salamangreat I think is one of the most mediocre tier 3 deck, more like Salam mediocre. The deck relies overly on drawing untouchable back row in order to contest fields, to break boards, to accomplish anything. In theory, it's really good that you have this insanely recursive engine with some protection in order to keep making plays over and over again. In practice, your plays are very limited. The Salamangreat monsters or their extra deck aren't really that powerful. The deck has so many choke points that it is insane to think that this deck is all that good without drawing specifically Book of Moon or Needle Sealing. Time Lords, one of the most recent decks that I think is a decent tier 3 contender. I'm gonna put it here. Time Lords can create some very annoying situations, often being able to set up Infinite Light as early as turn 1, well, turn 2 going into their opponent's turn, and actually being rewarded for losing their Infinite Light with the ability to instantly set up Sephiroth, at which point the deck just becomes huge beatdown strategy, but sometimes that is enough to win when you've exhausted your opponent's resources. I think it's a very interesting deck that is also very prone to not necessarily breaking, but losing in the long run, considering your monsters naturally shuffle themselves into the deck. And once you lose your Infinite Light, which is not the hardest card in the world to remove, even with its protection, you're basically stuck playing the Cephalon Turbo game. And if you haven't drawn Cephalon, you just lost. You just lose the game here and there. You just lost. That's it. Sulfur Cores, I think, is one of the better rogue decks of this format. It's still a rather new deck. It hasn't been like completely figured out yet. And it is insanely disruptible, but there is some potential, as there is with any Pendulum Shen, for this deck to rise above and surprise us all. I'd be very happy to see this deck overperform. Starry Nights is also rogue-ish, owing to its decent matchup against dark attribute decks, which would be Phantom Knights, Code Talker is a Decode Talker is a dark. That's pretty much it. The deck is also able to like offer some disruption, and there's a couple of like neat tricks here and there. It's a fun deck, I reckon. It's not all that good though. And last but not least, Water Xyz, I think, is a deck that should be here, probably. Water Xyz is not nearly as good as it used to be, owing to the loss of the Mori upgrade, I think the draw spell was called, which used to make it really, really consistent. And though Abyss Dweller is really good in this current format, it's not as good as it used to be because, well, you know, Gookies are not nearly as threatening, Infernoids are not nearly as threatening. Even Phantom Knights have like some ways to deal with it, owing to the fact that their skill cannot be responded to or dealt with in a traditional manner. That's annoying. But I don't know, other decks still make Abyss Dweller just better. Salamangreat can make Abyss Dweller more easily than Water Xyz can. And yeah, it's not nearly as good as it used to be. So yeah, that's my take on the tier list that I put like 10 minutes of thought into. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you agree or disagree, or if you plan on playing stage 2 of the KCC. I don't know if I will. The format seems kind of boring. Might give it a try, I don't know. Thank you for watching, take care everyone, and I'll see you next time.